Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Marvin Kalb. I'm director of the Shorenstein Barone Center here at the Kennedy School. And in one way or another tonight, our theme is the role and responsibility of the press in matters of national security. Not by coincidence, we are approaching the 20th anniversary of the Supreme Court ruling on the Pentagon Papers case. What happened briefly is this. In early 1971, Daniel Ellsberg, an unhappy former government official, gave reporter Neil Sheehan of the New York Times a copy of all but the last 4 volumes of a top-secret study of the Vietnam War, 47 volumes in all, an extraordinary leak even by the standards of the New York Times. On June 13, 1971, the New York Times began publishing the Pentagon Papers. The Nixon administration blew its stack. It got the courts to issue a temporary injunction. On June 26, the Supreme Court, by a vote of 6-3, ruled that the administration had failed to make its case that publication damaged the national security interests of the United States. At the time, it seemed like a stunning victory for the press, and it really was. But over the next 20 years, many questions have been raised about what the press has learned and about what the government has learned about the role and responsibility of the press in matters of national security. I'm not sure what the press learned, but it seems to me that the government learned that public opinion is one key to military victory, and controlling the press is one key to influencing public opinion. So it was with Grenada in 1983, Panama in 1989, and the Gulf War in 1991. Many questions are there to be asked, and we'll try to raise some of those questions tonight and to answer them. I'd like now to introduce our panel, which is distinguished and informed, and most important, they're here. From right to left, A.M. Rosenthal, now a columnist for the New York Times and for many, many years an editor of the Times and a reporter. He was managing editor of the Times at the time of the Pentagon Papers. Dean Erwin Griswold, a lawyer, an author, former dean of the Harvard Law School, Solicitor General during the Nixon administration. He argued the Pentagon Papers case for the administration. Professor Ernest May, one of the country's top authorities on American diplomatic history. Professor May was dean of Harvard College, director of the Institute of Politics here at the Kennedy School, chairman of the Department of History at the college. He was asked to help supervise the writing of the Pentagon Papers, but he refused. He said that it's apt to be bad history. And Pete Williams, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Information, a former television journalist from Casper, Wyoming, who has also served as press secretary and legislative assistant for Congressman, now Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney. Tonight, the 5 of us will discuss our subject, then open it up to you for your questions. There are microphones that are set up strategically to the right, the left, and in the balcony. I'd like to start with a series of questions, and the first concerns a definition of the phrase national security. We have heard a great deal about it. And at the heart of the Pentagon Papers case, and in so many other cases since that time, that term comes up time and time again. So I'd like to start with Abe Rosenthal and ask for his definition.
Okay. I've been involved one way or another in so-called national security cases as editor of the Times for about 25 years, before, during, and after the Pentagon Papers. And I think I'm just beginning to understand what the essence of it all is. Which is slow, but not as slow as sometimes of it. I really understand now, I believe, that the essence of a national security issue in this country, that is national security in relation to communication about those about so-called national security matters, is really not essentially a matter of law at all. As a matter of fact, today I did what I do almost all the time when I'm in a national security discussion. I go around and ask lawyers for the definition of national security. I asked 3 today, 2 said they didn't have one. One said if I gave him half an hour, he probably could come up with something. Now, that's a very important matter because we are constantly talking about national security. Papers like the Times, etc., are accused sometimes, in the case of the Pentagon Papers, in court of a crime of violating national security. That's not the specific crime, but that is the understood one. And we really don't know exactly what it is. Now, this essentially is a very good thing, because if this country ever sat down and tried to define national security, it would probably have to cover so many issues that it would be almost impossible for the press to function as we would want an American press to function. The British have defined it very neatly. They said basically anything the government doesn't want printed is in the interest that you can't print. That's national security. We have never accepted that in this country, and I don't even believe any government has put that forward I'm talking about the 20th century. So what we have in national security, basically, we get down to it, are matters of law peripherally, but essentially of politics, morality, how we see this country, our vision of this country, and what kind of a country we would like it to be. Now, when most people think about national security violations, they think of soldiers endangered, agents disclosed, military secrets revealed, weapons plans, and so on. Now, these are serious matters, and I don't dismiss them. I'd be an idiot to dismiss them, because obviously the more freedom you have, the more careful you have to be about how you use it. But the fact is that throughout this, I think, this whole century, World War II, certainly, I think in World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnamese War, there were no cases really proven or even brought, as far as I know, there may be one or two exceptions, about this kind of violation of military security, national security. Even though in Vietnam, reporters had access, they could fly around in helicopters all the time, there was no censorship. The relationship with the military was not the best. But even through those hard years, at the end of them, Barry Zorthian, who was then the briefer of the press, the representative of the government, he said this just recently, there was no violation of national security. Now, why is this? One of the reasons is that there was the reporters and editors involved in reporting, in disclosing these things or writing about them, are people not very much different than anybody in this room, except with certain more skills or background in dealing with military information. I don't have to have a law telling me not to disclose troop movements. I've never done it even when I was in India, covering a foreign country in its wars. I don't have to have a law that tells me not to disclose agents' names or military plans. So the law really, neither law nor censorship, produced this record of, almost complete record of no violation of national security in the sense that is normally meant. Now, when I say it's a matter of morality and politics, what I mean is that when you deal with a national security issue, and the ones that I have dealt with almost exclusively, you are not dealing with information that is going to blow up this country or hurt the armed forces in the carrying out of their current mission. You are dealing essentially with stories and information that are not matters of national security, but may be matters of national embarrassment or annoyance or humiliation, all things that governments take very seriously and do not want published. That essentially was the story of the Pentagon Papers. We dealt with an issue, with a war that was still going on, but none of the information in it was at all related to ongoing military information. As a matter of fact, within a very few years, 7 or 8 years after we won, in effect, the case, the high officials of the United States, including the Vice President Mondale, and we're praising the New York Times for having published these papers. Only recently, the former Solicitor General sitting here wrote a piece, I think 2 years ago, saying there were virtually no national security issues involved. So what I'm trying to get at is that when you see stories about national security, is that you are basically not dealing with military information. You are dealing with stories that one government or another would, in our society, considers embarrassing or humiliating or a political blow. These are all legitimate complaints, but they are not legal complaints. They are not the essence of national security issues as most people understand it. They are basically political, moral issues. And if we accepted the idea that a government that information that a government considered either embarrassing or against the national interest, which is every citizen's right to determine, that these issues could not be discussed, we would have an entirely different kind of press and I believe a different kind of society. We would have a society where the people of the country knew relatively little about what was taking place, because you simply cannot gear up for one story when you wish to print it if the press follows a policy of not printing stories that the government considers national security but are essentially within a political and moral and social area.
Hey, Williams, you buy all of that, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, thank you very much, Marvin. And it's great to see that the Soviet Union has found an outlet for its microphones. These are the largest lavalier microphones in the Western world, and it's great to have them. But it's a funny thing. My job right now is to be the Pentagon spokesman and the Assistant Secretary for the Public Affairs. And to do that particular job, which I've raised my right hand and taken an oath of office to do, I am required to sign a little piece of paper that Erwin Griswold, I'm sure, remembers very well. Anybody who's served in government and has ever handled classified information knows what it says. It says that you promise, under penalty of law, not to disclose classified information. So then you go and look for the definition of classified information. And there are several levels of it. There's confidential information, and there's secret, and there's top secret, and then there's levels of top secret. And you know all of this stuff,
Eyes
too.
only.
And of course it goes beyond that, top secret artichoke and top secret zebra and all that other stuff. But the definition of classified information is information which is, if released, would jeopardize the national security. So it's a good question. It becomes sort of a tautological thing. I think it's indefensible for the government to argue that things that are embarrassing or humiliating or unfortunate should be withheld or kept secret. I think that's indefensible. One of the other things that I do for a living in my job in the Pentagon is I am the appeal officer for Freedom of Information Act requests. If you want something from the Army, you go to the Army and you say, I'd like a document about the invention of nerve gas or something like that. And the Army may turn you down, or it may say yes, or it may partially disclose what you want. And then, if you're not satisfied, you have the right under the Freedom of Information Act to appeal that decision, and guess who's the appeal officer? So I see a lot of these cases come over my desk. Some of them, I must say, as a former journalist, I was very suspect of classified information when I came to the Defense Department. I had the impression that way too much stuff was classified. I'd read famous stories about how newspaper clippings were classified and that kind of thing. So I became very interested to see this stuff as it comes past my desk on what people want to get their mitts on. Now, you must understand that the majority of requests for information in the Freedom of Information Act do not come from enlightened scholars like you and ordinary folks. They come from a guy from, Ed's Electronics who wants to know what Hal's Electronics was able to sell to the Defense Department. So there's a lot of that. But when you get past that and get to just sort of folks wanting to know what their government's up to, I became convinced that there is some stuff that the government has a right to protect. I guess the most defensible stuff is what Intel boys call sources and methods. The sources by which you obtain certain information, the sources from which you obtain the information, and the methods which you use to obtain them. What sort of secret listening gizmos we have, and where they are, and what governments are cooperating with us to let us listen in on certain things, all those sorts of things that governments feel is important to protect the national security. So I guess there is some stuff out there that governments have a right to keep secret. It's a good question. I must say that I try not to invoke this mantra of national security in my job, and I flog myself if you catch me doing it, because I guess it is a hard thing to define. I have a legal obligation not to discuss classified information. It's against the law for me to do so, so I try not to do that whenever possible. But my peculiar and particular job at the Defense Department is to safeguard future, the kind of thing that Mr. Rosenthal is talking about, future military operations, specific military tactics. But again, we have a saying in my office, we don't discuss that unless we want to. So it is somewhat slippery. It used to be that the Navy would never discuss future ship movements, but there are cases where they want to say that this ship is sailing for the Persian Gulf. So it is a good question. I work there, and I don't know the answer to it. I can only say that I can think that there are legitimate things that governments need to protect. I think certain information is legitimately and rightly classified in the national interest, that national security should never be used as an umbrella for hiding embarrassing things, and that it's less of a problem for me to define that stuff, to define what the national security is in my job, because I have those limited circumstances. It's something that I hit in a case-by-case basis, and then I think it's pretty clear.
In Griswold, if you looked at all of your law books, would you find any definition of the national security?
No, I don't think that national security is in those two words, is a legal term. I think it is a perfectly good lay term, and as such is useful in intra-government conversation as well as in general conversation. As I see it, you have to divide and subdivide it a good deal. In the first place, there's external risks to national security. Some threat of somebody to, in the old days, to invade by crossing the borders. More recently, it is by sending nuclear bombs and other kinds of missiles long distances through the air. And I think there is a good deal of information there which has a proper bearing on the national security, and which, if the proper governmental officials classify it, there is a strong case for saying that it ought not to be disclosed. Then there is internal national security, which is in part in terms of insurrections and things like that, such as the Civil War was the most massive one we ever had, but it also relates to problems arising from groups who, for one reason or another, want to use violence internally. And that, if on a large enough scale, it seems to me can properly be regarded as national security. I agree with everybody that, and frankly, I'm a little sorry to hear it even referred to, that items that are embarrassing or humiliating can be properly classified because they have some relation to the national security. That, in part, turns on your definition of embarrassing and humiliating. It is very embarrassing that you made a major mistake which leaves wide open a door through which the country can be invaded by foreign military sources. In such a case, I would think it might have some relation to the national security. I had great difficulty at the time, and made it plain and said so, in finding that there was anything in the Pentagon Papers which adversely affected the national security. It all related to a period before the Nixon administration began. It closed with the end of the Johnson administration. I did not find things in it which were put there simply to avoid embarrassment. I found it on the whole a bona fide effort to record a lot of events which stated the circumstances which had got us involved in Vietnam and had led us to continue when we were there. Now, it is said that I have written that there was no threat to the national security. I think that is true with 20/20 hindsight. 20 years have passed since the Pentagon Papers were published, and I am not aware of any situation where any harm to the national security occurred. But I think it is a very different thing to say, looking ahead, will the publication of this material affect the national security? And I have never said that I didn't think there was proper basis for concern about the national security. I was particularly concerned with respect to two aspects. One related to prisoners of war and various agents, such as CIA agents and what in the 19th century were called spies, of which we had a good many behind the lines in Vietnam, and whether their names would be disclosed and whether harm would come to them. Here were 47 volumes, which I think must have had close to 1 million words in them, and I had 4 hours to review them, and I was not able to go through with enough detail to find out whether there were names and activities of agents disclosed. The other thing that I was concerned about was that the Pentagon Papers had extensive accounts of the efforts which were made to bring about negotiations of a diplomatic nature which would lead to a termination of the Vietnam conflict. And these were carried out through Soviet citizens. One particular case I noted was a Yugoslavian who had very good connections and who had been utilized and who had made some progress. And you must remember that these were in the days not long after Stalin, when all kinds of unkind things happened to people who did things of this order.
Am I not correct, Griswold?
Yes, I know, but I'm just going to finish this sentence. And I was concerned that harm would come to them, and I thought both of those things were properly related to the national security.
Thank you. I was going to ask you, though, that isn't it true that the 4 volumes of the 47, the 44 that were given at the Times, but the 4 that were left, 43 given at the Times, the 4 that were left did concern diplomacy, and those really have never been released.
The 4 volumes were never given to the New York Times,
right.
But I didn't know that at the time.
I see.
I knew what we had, and we had those 4 volumes, but the fact was, which the public has never understood and the press has never explained, that the papers which Ellsberg gave to the newspapers were not the same as the papers which were in the set, which was bound and in the in a safe in McNamara's and a few other officers. And I had every reason to believe that those 4 volumes were included in what was given to the papers.
Thank you. Professor May, does history provide any particular answers or insights into definitions of national security? And beyond that, what broader legacy do you see in the Pentagon Papers case?
Well, actually, by coincidence, I've been trying to trace how presidents have defined national security ever since George Washington, just by looking at the changing definitions. annual messages and State of the Union messages. It's a very interesting history that where the emphasis until about 1940 is on the preservation of the territorial unit. It was on Union early on, and then later on the avoidance of internal conflict, of class conflict, which is something that Theodore Roosevelt and Harding, among others, talked about quite explicitly. And otherwise the preservation of the territorial borders, and then it starts to expand in the Second World War and becomes world order, world peace in the period of the Cold War. But if you try to find something that runs through it, that if you, some definition that you would say has run constantly, it is something like the preservation of the national territory with the institutions and values of the nation intact, something like that. And if you take that kind of broad definition, it's hard to imagine any news story that would compromise national security with that definition. It's just no particular revelation could do so, could actually endanger the national territory or the values or institutions of the country. On the other hand, as Mr. Williams was saying, there's certainly lots of things that at the margin could be disadvantageous to those objectives, as he was citing. The disclosure or closing off of sources of information that could be advantageous, the injury to people who had rendered service to the United States. And there are, one of the problems with Mr. Rosenthal's statement is that it's not, I'm not sure that journalists actually know those margins very well, that they may, and they're very good themselves at piecing together stories from little scraps of information, and they can put something in a story that then in a foreign intelligence service can be converted into the recognition of what is an agent network or something of that sort. So that's possible, and you have to, I think you have to worry about it. But my impression is that there's a real difference between the general area in which you would talk about compromising national security and the question of disclosure of information. And there are arguments against the immediate disclosure of information that have nothing to do with the long-term preservation of national security. That, and it's not embarrassment, but quite often people inside the government want to do two things that they want to protect. One is that they want a degree of freedom to debate and to say things that they don't necessarily want out in the public. And another is that they want to control the timing so that the document or the evidence doesn't have a long life as something sensitive, but it has a short life. And while the issue is there and while they want to control, for example, just take things on budgetary issues, and there are these budget battles between the services, and the services are trying to control the agenda, and they're trying to leak things about each other, and they're trying to make sure that things don't get out from their standpoint prematurely. And it may be serviceable to the public for that to come out, but you can see the argument within the government for protecting that for a period of time. I guess the part that, as a historian, worries me most is the possibility of what is sometimes called the chilling effect of this on debate within the government, the possibility of disclosures like the Pentagon Papers affecting the quality and character of debate within the government, people being hesitant to put things on paper or even to say things for the record because they're afraid they might get out. Now, at the time of the original Pentagon Papers, and I was solicited about possibly doing a synthetic volume, not really supervising it, and I went down and worked on the Pentagon Papers for a few weeks and wrote a little piece in it and concluded and wrote a memorandum saying I didn't think they could do a good job of history because they were confined to too narrow a set of documents, and the guide rule said you could not go ask people in the White House questions, and I thought that was where the story really was, and I think that's the case. But if you look, I was worried that the Pentagon Papers would have the effect of chilling later discussion. It didn't have the effect I expected. It had a quite odd pair of effects that I didn't expect. One was, I think it had a direct effect on a much greater volume of record keeping and detailed record keeping in the Nixon administration. The Nixon's taping and some of Kissinger's record keeping was affected by the Pentagon Papers. They wanted detailed records of their own activities. At the same time, they were almost paranoid about preserving the secrecy of it, concerned, and Nixon referred to the Pentagon Papers quite often. And I think, though it's hard to account for the exception of the Carter administration, which is perhaps the most open administration in at least modern American history. But I think that's probably been a lasting effect since.
Abe, let's say that a year or so from now, a reporter for the New York Times comes to you and says, I just got a 47-volume top-secret history of the Persian Gulf War. I mean, I got it all, and the source is impeccable. Do you think the Times would be of the disposition to run that history as it did the Pentagon Papers?
I think we have that disposition, but I would hope we would do exactly what we did in the case of the Pentagon Papers, which is to hold ourselves up in a room somewhere, or a suite of rooms, and study them and go through them virtually page by page, in fact, page by page, with a whole team of people who understood what they were doing, who understood the responsibilities of the paper, who understood the communication intelligence requirements, and so on. And we took a considerable amount of material out of the Pentagon Papers because we thought it might. And then weigh it, and then not automatically do it. But if we found that these papers told us, let's assume, a great deal about the conduct of the Persian Gulf War, which I hope they, which showed that secrets were kept because they were political, or that the President of the United States was in effect, or a series of Presidents of the United States were lying or deceiving each other and deceiving the public, and that this happened 3 years ago. There's no ongoing military information. Yes, I was sure that we would print them, because I think we would then face the problem that we faced, all of us, when these papers were first printed. After all, we are hardly a wild-eyed extremist newspaper. We were very concerned with what we had. But after we looked at them, the real question became, and we're convinced that nobody's life was involved, and no military secrets were involved. You have to make a judgment. The question really became not what right did we have to print them, but what right did we have not to print them? This is a very serious, it's not being moralistic. I looked at this thing, we all looked at it and said, my God, we're sending troops still sending correspondents off to Vietnam. People are still debating the war. Here we have a great deal of information that people ought to know, and which cannot hurt a single American soldier, nor did it ever. And we just said, how are we going to sit on this stuff? And we decided, it frightened us, I must say, for the time. Looking at it, I'd never seen this kind of thing, secret information, all that. And once we decided that this was no prank, some massive Harvard freshman prank, we did worry about that the SDS had suckered us in and so on. At least I did. I didn't know you. Or at least we had to demonstrate. Well, the question was, how could we say nobody can see this? We had no right to do that. And I know this is hindsight, but I think just as I may be relying too much on hindsight or whatever, although it was foresight in our case, I must say, I think there was a tendency to kind of gloss over what the government actually did to us, taking us to court, one court after another, charging us with all kinds of horrible things, endangering the society, when the very lawyers, if you forgive my saying so, didn't know what they were talking about. You had 4 hours to study this stuff. We had 3 months, that's true. I don't know what else you would have done.
That sounds like prior restraint to me.
Well, I don't mind restraining lawyers, but I mean, that's their problem. Restraining lawyers. No, I don't mean to be too sharp about this, but basically we printed this thing one day, 2 days. They woke up about it. It was a long, boring story. And on Monday they woke up. Tuesday night we got an order from Mitchell to stop. Tuesday night we said no. And our own lawyers worked out on us, and on Wednesday we had an injunction. We obeyed the injunction. But the government didn't say, well, we think that we have to study this or whatever. The fact is, you rushed right into court. You had 4 hours to look at all this stuff and wing it. And that's what the government did. You wung it.
Hey, Griswold, you were put into a very awkward position by the President of the United States, in effect to ask you to argue a case of this importance
I would say
with 4
by
hours.
the New York Times and the Washington Post,
But
which ought to have been willing to allow me adequate time to understand what was in the papers before I proceeded, they having taken 2 months to do it before they came out.
What is the role that you ascribe to the President of the United States at that time?
Well, I understand, although I had no personal contact with him and was never told in those words, that he issued instructions that we should take every step we could to prevent the publication of the papers.
And what was on his mind, so far as you knew?
I didn't know it at the time, and I haven't any idea now, except that I understand from some subsequent publications that he was very heavily influenced by Mr. Kissinger, who 2 years later I learned states that Kissinger was not just a windstorm, he was a hurricane, and that he told the president that if you don't stop this, you'll show that you're a weakling. And that was more than Mr. Nixon at that time could take. And he issued this instruction to show that he was not a weakling.
What do you mean, but it was more than the president could take at that time? Was he under any particular strain or pressure?
I think we all know, I don't quite know what the term means, but it is freely used, has been freely used by the press and writers of books, that there was some kind of paranoia by which Mr. Nixon felt that he had enemies and was being attacked, and he was going to defend himself against it. It's one of the great American tragedies that this man of enormous ability, of very great effectiveness in international relations, should have had these violent reactions to some of these questions. And now that you've raised it, I'd like just to say one thing. I think that the Pentagon Papers case really had its origin here in Cambridge, about 3/4 of a mile away at the law school. After the war closed, one of our faculty members, who had been a colonel in the Air Force, Barton Leach, came to me and said he wanted to establish a defense policy seminar, because every time the country got into trouble, there were always Harvard Law School people all over the place, and they ought to have a little background in what kind of problems there were. And I said that I thought that was fine, and Bart taught it for 2 years. I also knew that after Bart had taught something for 2 years, he got tired of it. And he came to me and said, well, you know, I'd like to give it up, and I've found just the person to take it over. He's a graduate student in the arts and sciences, and everybody says he's the most able person that's ever come over the horizon, and it was Henry Kissinger. And so I authorized Henry Kissinger to do it jointly with Leach, and then later to do it alone. It was conducted at the old Litauer School, but 2/3 of the students were law students. And I am advised that one of the aides to Mr. Kissinger, just what his capacity was, I don't know, was Mr. Ellsberg. And I am also advised that one of the reasons that Kissinger turned into a hurricane was that one of the people he had had working for him was responsible for this disclosure.
Well, we've got a source right here. Dan Ellsberg, is that correct?
No, I was not an aide to Kissinger. I did actually address his seminar when I was a junior fellow a couple of times. However, there is reason to think, from what I've read, I think same source of reason, that he was embarrassed by the fact that I had been a consultant at the beginning of the Nixon administration and at the hotel here just before he came to Washington.
Pete Williams, the same question as I put to Abe Rosenthal. It's a year or so down the road, and you pick up the New York Times one morning, and you slap your head and you say, "My God, it's all there, all the secrets."
I do that every morning, basically.
All the secrets of the Persian Gulf War. What would you do? What would the reaction be?
Well, I don't know. It's a good question, but let me tell you that the case that's been posited here of budget documents, that's something that's classified, and they are. I've seen that happen twice in my instant brief tenure at the Defense Department. The first was in 1989 when Secretary Cheney was embarked in trying to carve $180 billion out of the defense budget. And how he was going to do it was a subject of tremendous interest on the part of the Congress and indeed OMB and the Marine Corps and everybody else. And he circulated to the military departments in November documents, classified documents, I think they were classified secret, saying, here's your budget program, this is what you have to hit. This is what the military people call the bogey. This is the bogey that you have to hit. This is your budget total. And here's how it breaks down for Army, and here's how it breaks down for acquisition, and here's how much stuff you can buy, and here's your operation and maintenance stuff. That was distributed to the departments on Monday, and on the following Sunday, the complete Technicolor details were in the Washington Post. And actually, they were Saturday in the Post. I'm sorry to say, Abe, Sunday in the New York Times. But
They weren't very good.
But the Post got it first. But you had more details in yours, so you each get a gold star. So I just wanted to say that you know, there is this perception in Washington that it's quote unquote the liberal press, whatever that is most interested in getting its mitts on classified stuff. Without naming publications, the most egregious leaks that I see involving the most highly classified of stuff is in some of the most conservative papers. Yeah. And this is something that that some of the senior policymakers, I don't seem to overlook that fact. That's fascinating to me that some of the juiciest things show up in some of the most conservative papers that deal with very sensitive
How do you think they got there?
Issues. Same way they get to the Post and the New York Times. Somebody has to give them to them.
It just occurred to me, Mr. Williams, have you guys prepared a Persian Papers? Somewhere?
Well, I don't know.
We're not asking for it.
This is a tough room. The simple answer to the question is I don't know because I assume that 47 volumes worth of history takes a while to prepare.
Give us the complicated answer.
The complicated answer is that Secretary Cheney has given a task to all of the military departments, all of the assistant secretaries, everybody down to the comptroller of the Defense Department, to prepare lessons learned by the Persian Gulf War. That includes the Joint Staff, civilian folks, military folks, and that's due to him by April 15th.
What lessons have you learned with respect to how you will deal with the press next time there is a conflict?
That is a disc jockey segue, if ever I heard one. And having been one, I'm qualified to say that, I guess. One must take a breath and pause. But we're talking about national security. We have to sort of change gears here now and talk about the Persian Gulf War. And it is in many ways a much different subject. In many ways, not so different. I think folks need to understand, and there are many professionals in this room who could explain this a lot better than I can, but there were sort of two broad issues in the Persian Gulf War. One was sensitive information that shouldn't be disclosed, and that's the same sort of stuff I guess we've been talking about. It's not much of an issue in this operation, as Mr. Rosenthal said, and I think as many reporters here would agree. Most reporters don't want, and I don't know of any who do, want to jeopardize a future military operation. They don't want to be responsible for writing a story that puts the troops in jeopardy. They may not agree with the war, they may not agree with the policy, they may think it's wrong, but once they start to cover it, no responsible journalist that I know of wants to write a story that says tomorrow afternoon the 101st Airborne is going to go 37 miles to the left and, you know, hike the football. So that was not such an issue. I think the most difficult issue in this was simply access to the troops. they always say that generals prepare for the previous war, and I think to some extent we were saddled by comparisons with Vietnam. Vietnam was an operation, as many of you well know, that from day to day involved isolated skirmishes. An encounter with the enemy over here, this riverine operation over there, jungle thing up there. Every now and then there'd be a big scale operation, the Tet Offensive or something like that. But Andy Glass going up to write a story in Da Nang about some encounter over here with this unit and meeting the troops and writing a story about that wouldn't have much influence on Colonel Norm Schwarzkopf's operation that was going to go on 2 days from then. So access was informal. It was what military people call a mature theater. You could hop a helicopter and go up somewhere and write a story and come back and file it and go out with the troops and come back with the troops because you didn't carry back with you any great secrets about how the war was going to go. You carried back with you the story of that specific unit's engagement with the North Vietnamese that day. The military was very worried about the situation in the Persian Gulf, which was a big set-piece operation. A combined air-land-sea campaign, as everybody knows now in great detail, that started with an air war of intense bombing, followed by, if necessary, a ground war. The ground war part of which involved this massive movement of troops out to the west, followed by this big swing up north to sort of surround the geographic boundaries of Kuwait. It was, in a sense, a slow, steady pulling back of the hammer on the pistol until, boom, the trigger was pulled and the war began. When the war began, when the air war began, there were reporters out on aircraft carriers that watched the first planes take off. There were reporters on battleships that saw the first cruise missiles being launched. There were reporters on airfields to see the first planes that took off on the first bombing raids. And so that was access that we were able to foster because we knew when it was going to start, and I don't think they did, or at least most of them didn't. I don't think knew the day on which it was going to start, or that the first cruise missile would be fired off the Wisconsin. So we were able to put reporters in those positions because we knew something they didn't know, that namely there was going to be something here they might want to see. When the ground war began, we had reporters out with every single Army division, every Marine Corps division, but nonetheless, that was only 133 reporters out with ground units, and there were many, many more reporters who wanted to be out with the troops. The military folks were concerned that if it was a sort of free-roaming battlefield, you know, you get in your Jeep, as they were certainly able to do, and you drive up there with the 82nd Airborne, and you hang out for a few days, and then you go back to Dahran to write your story. The military commanders were very, very nervous about that. They didn't like the prospect of reporters going out, learning their secrets, and coming back and writing stories. Now, you can say, as has been said, that Barry Zorthian, who was the spokesman for the State Department during Vietnam, said, you know, there really were no problems with that. But military commanders would respond by saying, yeah, but this isn't Vietnam we're worried about. This is a big set-piece operation, a big stakes operation. 500,000 of their guys on this side, 500,000 of our guys on this side, and we don't want them to know what the play is.
Now, I'm listening to you, but I don't hear the lessons of the Persian Gulf operation with respect to the press.
All right. Well, I appreciate you permitting me that preamble, just so everybody will understand what it is now about which we have lessons to learn. The lessons are, one, that the military must do a much better job of communicating reporters' stories back to their editors and the folks at home. We are held now to a 24-hour standard of turnaround. Whether that's fair or not, it's the way journalism works in the 1990s. Some of our military units did very well at this, some did very poorly. That's a special problem for television because you either have to have a satellite unit with the troops, which is a kind of cumbersome thing to set up, especially if the troops are moving quickly, or you have to have some means to literally carry the videotape back, because it's hard to transmit videotape over a telephone line or a two-way radio. We need to do better there. I hope that never again am I involved in another pool as long as I live unless it has water in it. Journalists hate pools. I hate pools. The worst part of the job for anybody in this position is setting up and writing herd on a pool. Given the specific limitations of this operation, a pool seemed to be the fair way to do it. But you know, a pool is not a magic answer, and no one should assume that because pools were used in this operation, we're always going to use pools again.
Supposing someone like Barbara Cohen, the Washington bureau chief of CBS News, told you we're not going to participate in pools any longer. These pools simply don't work. We feel trapped. We don't like it. We won't do. What would you do?
I'd say two things. Number one, many reporters, indeed one very distinguished bureau chief here tonight made that point during the operation, said, you know, and I'll tidy this up a little bit, he said, dash your pools. And some reporters did. Bob McEwen of CBS News chose to go with the Saudis and got a pretty good story. Not the most significant part of the story, I would argue, but a good story. Forrest Sawyer of ABC chose to go with the Egyptians. Again, got a pretty good story. My point to you is, Marvin or Barbara Cohen, if you want Alan Pizzi from CBS News to go with 101st Airborne, is he going to use the CBS Apache helicopter to go with them? I mean, there are some cases where pools are not all automatically bad. Just as everything didn't go all badly in this, everything didn't go all well in this. It's not all good or all bad. In some cases, pools make sense. The first reporters that got to Saudi Arabia came on a DoD pool because the Saudis were not issuing visas. We got the first Western reporters into Saudi Arabia. There are some kinds of military operations for which pools make sense, and I think reporters would agree with that. I hope we don't. I'm certainly not saying we'll always have pools ever, never, amen. And I hope Barbara wouldn't say never again a pool. I think that would be equally wrong.
We're getting to that time where I'd like to invite those of you who would like to ask questions to come to the microphones now. Just walk over to the microphones wherever they are. And as you're doing that, I'd like to ask Professor May a question that relates to the popularity of wars. That in American history there have been wars which have been very popular. We just lived through one. Wars very unpopular. The War of 1812 survived that too. What does it mean when you're in the midst of a popular war or an unpopular war with respect to what the executive can do and what the latitude of the press might be?
I'm not sure there's any answer to that, because I think about two unpopular wars of recent time, Korea and Vietnam, and they were both handled quite differently by both the executive branch and the press. I think it was the degree of division about the war that affected it, and you have simply a different public, a different press, different sized press corps, different readership and viewership in the country when you get to the 1960s as opposed to the 1950s, and I think the difference may not be the unpopularity of the war, but the character of both the size of the executive branch, the complexity of its activities, and the size and complexity of the press covering it.
And the length of the war, probably.
Right.
Okay, why don't we start here with the first question, please. And by the way, with these questions, please, just questions, no speeches, and that's the same for the panelists.
I'll try to make it quick. I was out of the country this past year, and two things struck me about the press coverage. One, I often found much more critical questions and critical information in the European press. The second thing that struck me is how much the war, especially on television, was turned into a sporting event. It was showdown in the Gulf. We maybe had more genteel images late in the war. The war was a turkey shoot mowing down Iraqi troops. Now we hear the military is having NFL films make their highlight films. I'm wondering if you could comment on this sort of Hollywoodization, maybe Super Bowlization of war, how it affects critical understanding of war and how much the media plays into this particular type of coverage.
Okay, thank you. Dean Griswold, would you like to answer that?
I don't know that I have any great background for answering that, having seen none of these foreign broadcasts that you said. I do think that there is a great tendency for the electronic media to regard themselves as more in show business than in the news business. And that, I think, is very unfortunate. That shows up particularly with respect to broadcast reports of trials and police beatings and various things relating to the administration of justice.